Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to do a final review of the Anbernic RG476H. And I don't know about you, but after seeing the latest string of letters and numbers which constitutes the next Anbernic handheld, it starts to feel a bit like more of the same. I think that companies like Anbernic have created their own problem by oversaturating the market, and it gets really hard to decide which one is actually going to be worth buying. We're obviously going to talk a lot about that in this video, but to make things simple, if you are looking for a device around $150 and also focused on retro gaming, this one is probably my favorite right now. I've already done an impressions video talking about, the look and the feel of this handheld. I'll leave it linked down below, so all those details are going to be there. In this video, we're going to focus on whether or not I think it's worth it and some of my favorite things about it that I've discovered over the past week or so. But even though it is an excellent handheld, it may not be a good fit for you depending on what you already own and what systems you're actually trying to play. So we'll talk about all that in this video. Grab a snack and drink. Let's go ahead and get started. Before we even get started, I had a question the other day that kind of threw me off. Someone didn't know what I did when I reached up to push a button or whatever I'm doing up there. That's because I have a different camera right here. That's the green matte camera that you always see. And so what I'm doing is I'm turning that camera off in between different segments. Anyway, that has nothing to do with this video, but if you were ever wondering why I do that, that is why. Let's start by talking about what this thing is. It's the Anbernic RG476H. And admittedly, at face value, those numbers and letters don't make a lot of sense, but there is some meaning behind them. The RG stands for retro game, and then the 47 is the size of the screen, 4.7 inches. The number after that signifies which generation of Anbernic device it is. They started with the 350, then the 351, and so on. So this is the 6th generation, not counting the 0 generation. And this particular generation has the Unisoc T820 CPU inside of it. It's the same as we've seen in other devices with a 6 in their name, the RG556, the RG406H, and then the RG406V. There are a couple other stragglers with that chipset like the RG Slide and the RG Cube. Those ones don't really fit the mold. And then finally we have that H at the end, and that just annotates that it is a horizontal handheld, and generally when they use the H it also means that it's plastic. And so that's what the name means, and Anbernic just assumes you can understand that code, but obviously that nomenclature is really for people who understand how to decode it. It's also worth noting that the 476H is not the most powerful or latest chipset in their arsenal. There is a 7th generation already, which is the RG477M, and another device called the RG557. So this one here is not the latest and greatest, but it is $100 cheaper than the 477M, which has a much more powerful processor. Now in terms of pricing, it just went on sale yesterday, and it starts at $150 plus shipping for the first few days. After that, it's going to raise up to $165 plus shipping as its retail price. Now the thing about Anbernic is that they distribute these to other vendors who then sell them on AliExpress, and you will often find deals for them. So if you like that $150 price point, even after it jumps up, if you just wait a couple months, it will usually drop back down when there are sales. Either way, I'll leave links to their direct website as well as their AliExpress page down below. Now, this is a review unit, so it was sent over from Anbernic, but like with all my videos, they're not seeing this ahead of time, no money was exchanged in any way, and all opinions are my own. Now the way we're going to break down this video is kind of like some of my other final reviews in that we're just going to talk about some of the major bullet points that I've discovered over the past week or so, the things that really stand out about this device. So talking point number one is I love this display. I've seen it now in 3 different Anbernic handhelds, and I just keep liking it more and more. I've been waiting for years for a screen like this, and now that it's here, I'm super happy. So number one, this is a 4.7 inch display with a 4:3 aspect ratio. And a lot of my favorite retro systems, basically all the way up to the GameCube and PS2 era, mostly focused on a 4:3 aspect ratio. So everything is an excellent fit. And 4.7 inches is fairly massive, even compared to something that was previously pretty impressive, like this one here, the RG406H. So this one has the exact same processor inside, and at the time, I thought this was one of the best horizontal handhelds that Anbernic had ever made. In terms of square inches, the RG476H is 38.5% larger than the RG406H, which was still a pretty nice big screen as of last year. So in particular, if you are interested in having doing big screen gaming with a 4:3 aspect ratio for classic games, this is a really excellent fit and probably the best of those that Anbernic has released so far with this particular screen. The display is also a high-resolution 1280 by 960, which gives you a lot of scaling options when it comes to retro gaming. A quick example here is Mega Man X. This is a game that when playing with non-integer scaling, meaning that you're just blowing up the pixels to match the display, if you're using a lower resolution screen, it's going to have like a lot of imbalances here with Mega Man's life bar. Now I can still see some imbalance with the life bar. You can see there's a couple black bars that are a little bit thicker, but it is relatively minor compared to, say, for example, a 480p display. Now, even though this resolution is not a perfect integer scale for most of the retro systems, it's so high that you can kind of get away with either just using non-integer scaling, or if you do use integer scaling, the black bars around the sides are going to be relatively minimal. And so here's the game running in integer scaling, and yes, we get some black bars around the edges, but I think they are relatively thin, and we also have perfectly balanced pixels. So you can see the life bar is perfectly balanced. So it'll really come down to what you prefer, whether or not it's going to be integer scale or non-integer scale. Do you want to blow the screen up all the way? It's really up to you. One thing that is kind of interesting about this whole setup is that, it's an all-glass display on the front, which means that there is no real bezel along the sides, but you can actually add it by adding integer scale. So this kind of gives it a more retro vibe, but then also balances the pixels even better. There are other tricks you can do, like interpolation shaders. I did a whole shaders guide around this time last year. I'll leave it linked down below if you're interested in checking it out, but you do have a lot of options to work with when it comes to scaling thanks to this high resolution. And so that's my main point here. Another benefit of this display is that it has a 120 Hz refresh rate. I also did a video talking about this. I'll leave it linked down below, but in a nutshell, it improves motion clarity when you're playing your games so that your characters and sprites just feel like they are moving a little bit more clearly, kind of like how they did on old CRT televisions. You can then combine it with CRT shaders like this one, which will then give you just a more retro look and feel as you're playing, and I think this really elevates the experience even more for me. Now, I already mentioned that this does have an all-glass display up front, and this can be a good or bad thing depending on what you prefer. I'm kind of indifferent to it, but one of the neat things about it is that it covers up the bezels around the display, so it does give you a pretty seamless experience as you're playing. And the device comes in 3 different colors, the indigo that I have here, a black, as well as a retro gray or tan. But one thing I've noticed is the gray model does have a little bit of black borders around the edges. The guys over at Retro Handhelds did a first look live stream the other day, and I saw it in that video that basically there was a little bit of a black border around the tan one. So if that is something that might bother you, you may want to look for a different color. When it comes down to it, I love this display. I think it is an excellent size, an excellent refresh rate, an excellent resolution. It is LCD, so it's not an OLED panel, but I think that the colors and everything else are still very nice, and so it's something I'm willing to live with. My second point is that I think this device has excellent controls, especially if you use it for what it's designed to play. First and foremost, it is a D-pad centric layout, which means that, playing something with the D-pad and the face buttons just feels naturally very good. The face buttons in particular are awesome. They are nice and springy with a rubber membrane connection, and they're also super quiet, like they're nearly silent, and so I really enjoy using these buttons. The D-pad also has that classic kind of bouncy feel to it. I think it is an excellent D-pad too. The major design choice that sets this apart from the RG477M is that this one had stacked shoulder buttons and triggers. Now, that makes this device more pocketable because it's more sleek, but it's also not a very natural feeling to have to reach over the shoulder button to reach the trigger. By contrast, the 476M has stacked shoulder buttons and analog triggers as well, so I do think that overall, in terms of control inputs, this is the superior setup. The triggers themselves feel good, and it's nice to have something to rest my fingers on when I'm playing. My one gripe about this is that the shoulder buttons are a little bit clicky and loud. I'll give you a quick listen right now. So yeah, sadly, these are the loudest buttons on the device, and they are quite clicky. This is something that I wish they had dampened inside with like a little bit of a rubber bumper. There are ways to fix this, so you can open it up and put a little bit of tape in the connector right there, and that's going to dampen the sound a little bit and make it a little bit mushier. So there are DIY fixes for that, but I would rather the company just do it themselves. Now, in terms of ergonomics, it is a flat device, but I think it works out pretty well because it's relatively tall with this 4:3 aspect ratio. window. So there's plenty of space for all of my fingers. I don't really have any issue not having any sort of ergonomic bumps here on the back because it's something I can just kind of cup and play. So in general, when playing D-pad centric games, this has been perfectly comfortable for me. So the way I see it, this device really shines when playing D-pad centric games, which honestly I think is the focus of this handheld in the first place. So this is what I've been enjoying the most. You know, my 16-bit classics, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, stuff like that I think is just a really excellent fit, especially when you combine it with all the other things we already talked about, like black frame insertion and a CRT shader, and it gets to be a really cool experience. The analog sticks are also decent. They have Hall effect sensors, which means that they're not going to be prone to stick drift, and they have a nice wide range of motion, and they are very accurate. And I think when playing single analog stick style games like Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast, it's still an excellent fit because you can easily reach that thumbstick and you can kind of slide your hand down a little bit better, which is a very easy thing to do because there are no ergonomic bumps on the back. And so I do find this still to be comfortable when playing with a left analog stick. Where things get a little bit wonky for me is when trying to play stuff that is dual analog stick centric, just because the reach between the analog sticks and the shoulder buttons is a little bit high on a 4x3 device like this, with analog sticks that are positioned so low. So I personally just don't generally like to play FPS style games on this device because I think it is more D-pad centric. Okay, my third point here is that I like the fact that they went with a plastic device. I think it is the right move. That's also the major difference with the RG477M. This one is made with a metal shell, and it feels more premium in the hand, but it also gets warmer and is heavier, and also kind of just feels like a brick compared to like a toy, which I prefer to have with my retro gaming systems. This one's about 20% lighter than the RG477M, so it's not a huge difference, and a lot of that is because this one is still a little bit chunky. It's about 300 grams, and some of that has to do with that all-glass front, which is heavier than plastic. But in general, I am pro-plastic when it comes to these retro handhelds. It reminds me more of something out of the 80s and 90s, which is exactly what I'm going for. The RG476H does have active cooling. You can see the fan intake and exhaust right here, and it's relatively quiet, especially compared to the RG477M, which is pretty noisy. This one I just leave in the auto mode, which is just going to ramp up when it needs it, and it rarely does. Instead, it keeps the device relatively cool and also silent. There are some times when I can feel a little bit of warmth right here only when playing PS2 games, and honestly, it doesn't bother me at all. It's just something I've noticed. It never gets to the point of actually being hot. So overall, I like the material design of the RG476H. I like the plastic feel on the back, and I also don't really mind this glass front. Now, I think that ideally, to keep it even lighter, I would have preferred to have plastic on the sides as well, but I understand that Anbernic was kind of going for something new with this design here, and more or less it does work. Okay, my fourth point here is that the device feels a little bit underpowered for two main reasons. The first is that this chipset feels a little bit stale inside of an Anbernic handheld right now. We've already seen 4 other devices over the past year and a half that have used this chipset. And the second point is that they've already moved on and used a new chipset in 2 other devices, so it kind of feels like a step back. And so that's the third major difference between these two devices. The one we're reviewing today has the stacked shoulder buttons as well as the plastic material, but then it also has a much weaker chipset. To give you an idea, running a Wildlife Extreme benchmark, you can see that this scores 576, but the 477M is nearly 6 times more powerful. It's 3,166. So there is definitely a performance difference between the two, and it really just comes down to PlayStation 2 and GameCube emulation. I did some demonstrations in my impressions video, but just as a quick recap here, this device is pretty good with GameCube as long as you keep it to a native or a 1x resolution and you mainly stick to the more lightweight titles. In particular, I do think the Dolphin emulator that runs GameCube does a better job than PS2, and so I am more confident in saying that yeah, you can probably play a good majority of games in GameCube on this device, again at a native resolution. A lot of these games will have some slowdowns here and there and maybe some compatibility issues just due to this Mali GPU, but in general it is relatively rare to find a game that I would consider to be unplayable on GameCube with the T820 chipset in this device. So I do think that GameCube is pretty good, but again at that native resolution which looks a little bit fuzzy on this 960p screen. Moving over to PS2, it is going to be a lot more hit and miss. Again, starting out at native resolution here, which will look a little bit fuzzy, and there are going to be many lightweight games that do play at full speed and I think are perfectly playable. And so I'm not saying that you can't play PS2 games on this. It is worth experimenting to kind of see how it'll all work, but I wouldn't recommend buying this device to play PS2 games on. One quick update, a couple people mentioned to me that the older version of NeitherSX2, which is the emulator that we run on PS2 for Android, it actually runs better than the latest version of NeitherSX2 with this particular chipset. And so I went back and I retested all of my games, and there are some games that run better with this older version, so you might want to look into this as well. Games like Ratchet & Clank and Midnight Club 3 Dub Edition play better. They're not 100%, there's still going to be some slowdowns here and there, but I did find these to be a better experience with this older version of the emulator. The version that we're using here is 1.5 versus 2.0. It's not going to be a catch-all and fix every single game. There are still going to be others that are just going to be relatively slow, but it does improve even games that I would consider to be unplayable with that other version of NeitherSX2, including God of War 2. This one still has some slowdowns, but it's right at the cusp of what I would actually tolerate if I was desperate to play this game on PS2. But be warned that there are some games that actually seem to perform worse with this older version than the new one, so there is some trade-offs there. So Jak 3 I think is terrible, same thing with NBA Live 2005. At the end of the day, like I said, I would not buy this device to play PS2 games on, but if you're going to buy it to play retro games anyway, and you've got a couple PS2 favorites, you might as well load them up and see if they work. You've got other tricks that you can do, like underclocking, as well as using PAL versions of ROMs, which will only run at 50 frames per second. So you can kind of finagle it a little bit more to get more performance power. But for me personally, I like to focus on the retro stuff. Your very lightweight systems, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, these are all going to play brilliantly. They're just completely effortless. And same thing with your 8-bit and 16-bit era games too. These are all going to run with absolutely no problem. There is plenty of power for this stuff. One limitation of this chipset with retro systems is that you cannot stack on heavy-duty shaders and still use it with like subframe BFI or just black frame insertion in general. So in this example right here, I am using the CRT Beam Simulator shader, which does allow us to use that increased motion clarity. And then I've added a Z-Fast CRT shader. That's a lightweight CRT shader, and it's working great. I'm not getting any flickering or anything, and I'm also getting that nice motion clarity, but then also a light CRT effect. If we use something that's a little bit more heavyweight, like the CRT Geom shader, you can see that it doesn't reach a full 60 frames per second, and that's what's causing this flickering on the screen, because it isn't reaching the full 120 to be able to use the CRT Beam shader. So there is going to be a limitation in which shader you can use if you want to take advantage of that 120 Hz refresh rate and all the tricks that we can do to increase that overall look. And this is something that you can absolutely do with the RG477M if you are trying to prioritize heavy-duty shaders as well as that black frame insertion or CRT beam. You can do all that on that device, but not so much on the 476H. But if you're willing to live with a lightweight shader, you can still have this all stacked up. For example, the CRT Geom Mini shader, which doesn't look quite as good, but still pretty effective. This one works just fine with the CRT Beam Simulator shader. So you can still have a very nice retro experience, but it is somewhat more limited compared to a more powerful processor. Now, thankfully, shaders aside, this processor is plenty powerful to be able to play all my favorite retro systems up through Gen 5. And so this means everything from the early 3D era, PS1, Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, all of these will work very well, and you can also upscale them to match the 960p resolution that we have on this display. This means that when playing these systems, you can have ultra crisp graphics, and again, on a 4.7-inch display, it's going to be that much more impressive. So I think that if you're looking to play this era of games, then it is an excellent fit, especially with that 4:3 aspect ratio. Just don't try to throw on a bunch of shaders on top too. The only compromise when it comes to these retro systems is going to be Sega Saturn, because this system cannot run with the Beetle Saturn core, which is much more accurate. Instead, you'll have to use Yaba-san Shiro, which is still an excellent core, and you can play most of the games this way anyway, but it's not going to be quite as accurate as it is with playing with the Beetle one. For my part, I still think it's an excellent Saturn experience, so I wouldn't mind playing the games on this handheld either. And one other note, for PSP, all these games are going to run great. You can play them in a 3x resolution with no problem whatsoever, but bear in mind that it's a 16:9 aspect ratio, so you are going to get black bars on the top and bottom. The image, I think, is still big enough to be able to play on. It's 4.3 inches, and so for me, this is clearly legible, and I'm able to play everything with no issue. But of course, there are better devices to play PSP on. And beyond GameCube and PS2, which we already covered, you can play some very lightweight Nintendo Switch games as well. Now, we're talking the lightest of the lightweight games, things like Sonic Mania and so on. Don't try to push it with something like Hades or Super Mario Bros. Wonder. It's just not going to work. But if you do have a couple favorite indie games that are very lightweight, you might be able to play them on this handheld as well. And of course, also bear in mind, this is an Android-based device, so you'll be able to play some Android games too. I wouldn't push it with things like Genshin Impact and the like, but you can still play some medium weight and lightweight Android games on here as well. And then of course, when all else fails, you could also stream onto this device from a local PC or over things like GeForce Now or Xbox Cloud streaming. Using Apollo and Artemis, I got about 6.5 milliseconds of decoding time, which I think is relatively decent, but not as good as I've seen with some other streaming-focused handhelds. Another thing I found is that I prefer just to play D-pad-centric games on this, even when streaming too. So even though, yes, I could play something like Cyberpunk on this, I would rather play something where I can use the D-pad. Now, one benefit of this device not being super powerful is that it does not require a lot of battery, and so the battery life on this device is actually pretty great. Let's run through this quick summary. We'll start with the top right, so I play everything at 50% brightness and volume, and then I got 2% standby drain overnight. That means that when I put it to sleep by tapping on the power button, when I came back the next day, it had only dropped 2%. I did 4 different power profiles here to give you an idea of what kind of battery life to expect. On the far right, I played Mega Man X on the Super Nintendo with 120 Hz enabled, but with no shaders, so it's just running kind of clean at that point. The reason why I kept 120 Hz on is because that will reduce input latency, so it'll feel a little bit snappier compared to other 60 Hz devices. And in this example, I got 14 hours and 28 minutes of battery life. That is a ton of time to play your retro games. That's going to include everything like, Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, and Genesis, and all that other stuff. You can expect close to 14.5 hours of gameplay time. Now, in my next tier, I kept the 120 Hz on, but this time I turned on the CRT beam shader as well as the Geom mini shader. So I have 2 CRT shaders running at once to give me that retro look and feel. Because it is more demanding, it is going to reduce the battery life, and it's pretty significant. It's down to 10 hours and 32 minutes. Now, 10 hours of gameplay is still amazing, but if you're really trying to squeeze as much as possible, then using shaders will drain that battery more. For my next scenario, I used PlayStation 1 playing Chrono Cross here, again at 120 Hz to improve that overall input latency. And then also I played it at a 4x resolution to be able to max out the resolution on this display. And this time around, I got 8 hours and 17 minutes of battery life, which I think is still very decent with upscaled PS1. You can expect something pretty similar when it comes to other systems like Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast as well. And then finally, our worst case scenario is playing Psychonauts on PS2, again at 120 Hz for input latency, but at that native 1x resolution. Now, this is not the most taxing game that you can play on this device, but it can play at relatively full speed, and so I feel like this is the best playable experience that you can have. And this time around, I got a little bit under 5 hours of battery life, which I still think is pretty darn decent when pushing this device so far. My next point is that given everything this device has and can do versus what it cannot do, I think it's priced pretty fairly. It's $150 plus shipping right now, but that'll go up to $165 in a couple days, and then after that, it'll probably drop down during sales and whatnot. So I'm thinking of it like, $150 to $175 with shipping and all of that. And I think at around that price point of $150 to $175, this thing is probably the best deal that you can get right now. At around the $100 price point, these would be the devices I recommend, the Mangmi Air X as well as the Retroid Pocket Classic. The Classic has an OLED display and also has a really nice Game Boy style setup. The Air X has a wider aspect ratio and excellent controls as well. I think this is an ideal PSP-minded device in particular. So I think for $100, these are an excellent fit too. But also bear in mind that the RG476H is quite a bit more powerful than the other two. Let's use our Wildlife Extreme score as a quick benchmark. So 576 here, but then on the Mangmi it's 118, and on the Retroid Pocket Classic it's 174. But also bear in mind that these numbers are not a perfect correlation. The Retroid Pocket Classic has a weak GPU, and this is a GPU-related benchmark, so the score is low because of that. The CPU on this is actually very powerful, and it can emulate just about everything you can think of that you can do on the RG476H, but it lacks an analog stick, so there are some limitations just in the control perspective when playing on this system. If you're willing to go up a little bit more to around the $200 to $230 price point, then we have the Snapdragon 865 devices to consider as well, like the Retroid Pocket 5, the Retroid Pocket Mini version 2, as well as the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. All three of these devices have the same chipset, and it is quite a bit more powerful than the RG476H. Again, going back to our benchmark, you can see this one is 1,327 versus 576 on the 476H. So this one is at least double the performance power of the other one, which means it's going to be better when it comes to PS2 and GameCube and some additional systems as well. And then finally, if you're willing to spend $250+, then that's where the RG477M comes in, because this one is about 6 times more powerful than the 476H we're reviewing today. And this one is a lot better when it comes to PS2 and GameCube. And of course, you can throw on those additional shaders and whatnot as well. So in the end, it really comes down to what you want and what you're willing to pay for. If you think that, something like PS2 and GameCube as well as heavy-duty shaders are a priority for you, but you still want a very retro-focused handheld, then that's where the RG477M comes into play, but it is $100 more expensive than the one we're reviewing here. So that's the other factor, is if you're not going to be focusing too much on GameCube and PS2, then I think this one is a much better fit, and you'll save a lot of money. And I think at around that $150 price tier, this is the one to beat. Let's use the 406H as another example. This one is also $150 with the exact same chipset, but I would much prefer to play on the one we're reviewing today. It's got a bigger display, a higher refresh rate, and just in general, I find it to be more comfortable, and it's also D-pad centric, which is a better fit for retro gaming. This one does have some advantages, like the fact that it has ergonomic bumps if you really want something to grip onto while you're playing. But again, I don't have any ergonomic issues with the larger back here as well. So I just think in general, this one is the one to beat at $150 if you want a horizontal handheld. Now, that being said, this device is still imperfect, so let's talk about some of the hiccups that might be a deal breaker for you before we wrap up and kind of talk about whether or not this is going to be a good fit. My first nitpick is that the microSD card flap right here on the bottom does not stay flush. It just kind of pokes out a little bit once you add a microSD card. Now, this hasn't happened to everybody, but I think the majority of testers so far have seen this as an issue. So that's really unfortunate. And I think it's probably something you could fix by tearing the device down and maybe clipping a little bit of this small strap that's here on the flap and just kind of cutting this down a little bit more, and it might be an easier fit. Either way, it's just a very slight annoyance, but this might be a big deal for other people. Another thing I don't like about this device is the start and select placement here on the bottom right. It just feels like an unnatural placement. I would much rather have it up top so I could, just hit start and select when I need to, instead of having to reach down to the bottom. Another hiccup with this device is that it is not capable of doing video out and charging at the same time. For example, here with this monitor, I can do power delivery as well as video out, and it just doesn't work. Instead, it just charges the device without video out, and it's the same thing if you try to use a USB-C dock. Now, if you use an HDMI to USB-C adapter like this that doesn't have any power enabled to it, you can get video out on this device. It's just kind of a pain that you have to watch the battery life because you cannot charge it at the same time. So either way, yes, you can consoleize this device by connecting it to a TV or monitor, but with some limitations. I've got two other nitpicks, and they are software related. The first has to do with the ABXY pattern. Like with a lot of these other retro-focused devices, the A button is going to be on the right, and that can be fine, when playing like a Super Nintendo game because it's a natural fit. But when trying to play an Android game or trying to stream, it's going to be weird, where generally the button that you use to confirm, which is down below in most US games, it's going to be on the right side. So it's going to be a bit awkward when trying to play those games. Now, thankfully, most of these manufacturers have figured out on the software side that they can use a toggle to go between like the Nintendo Switch mode and the Xbox mode, and so you can just toggle between that. And this device does it, and it works great until you try to restart or power down the device, because when you restart the device with this chipset, for some reason, it always reverts back to Nintendo Switch mode. This has been the same problem that we've seen on all the other devices with this chipset over the past year and a half, and unfortunately it just hasn't been fixed here. So again, a slight annoyance in that you have to go in and swap this out every time you reboot your machine. In the Anbernic Android builds, they also have what they call auto mode and high mode. This is supposed to be like your high performance mode, but as we've seen with this chipset, it doesn't really seem to do anything. Here are two benchmarks that I ran side by side, this one in the auto mode and this one in the high mode. And you can see the difference is 2 points, which is nothing. That's just a negligible difference. And so unfortunately, the high performance mode does not seem to include better performance. I've seen a little bit of better performance when trying to play PS2 games, but that's it. And it's really hard to demonstrate. And so in general, that's one of the things that's a bit annoying about this device as well, is that we don't have true performance profiles. In the grand scheme of things, some of these nitpicks may bother you, some of them may not, but I did want to list them here in case they are important in your buying decision. So putting this all together, my last major point here is that this is kind of an unexciting handheld, but also very solid. So far this year, Anbernic has taken a couple risks and also played it very safe. One of the riskier handhelds is the RG Slide. That's the slide up one. You guys may remember my review from earlier this year. But I feel like the RG476H is like the safest of the safe handhelds that they've ever made. After all, they're using an older and tried and true chipset, and honestly, it's just probably a very easy device for them to manufacture, but with enough upgrades and tweaks to it that make it very compelling all around. And I have really been enjoying my device. I've been using it in two major different ways. It all really comes down to the launcher. So for example, I use Emulation Station Desktop Edition as my main front end. So this is how I navigate through my systems and pick my games. I've got it all curated and set up. I've, scraped the box art so I can have the box as well as like the media playing afterwards. And so it's a really excellent experience. I've gone through and configured all the emulators and I am ready now to rock and roll. I've also loaded up the Beacon front-end launcher, which again works a lot like Emulation Station Desktop Edition, but is a little bit more simple and I have more control over the box art. And so I've really been enjoying this overall setup too. I recently did a Beacon launcher video. So in essence, my experience is the same between the two. I just kind of navigate through my systems, then browse my games, then choose one and launch it. And it's all been pre-configured within each of the emulators. If you have no idea what I'm talking about in terms of setup, I will leave my Android starter guide down below. It's the same with any of these Android-based handhelds, so the process is going to be exactly the same. It does take some time to get set up, but once you got the hang of it, it's pretty easy. When it comes down to it, the RG476H kind of feels like a best of between these two different handhelds, provided that you're willing to make a couple compromises. The 406H, I think, is quickly overshadowed by the 476H, unless you want nice ergonomic bumps on the back, because this is a bit more comfortable. But then also, if you want additional power, then the 477M is going to be a better handheld. But I think for everything else, I would rather use the plastic one. And so over the past week, but even really over the past month, I've had a bit of an emotional roller coaster. If you remember on my RG477M video last month, I said that this thing is like my retro dream machine, but I also reserved the right to change my mind if they made a plastic version with stacked shoulder buttons. And look at that, a month later, they actually have that one, but with a weird asterisk and caveat to it in that it's not quite as powerful. And so I am personally a little bit torn between the two, like which 4.7-inch 4:3 aspect ratio device am I going to use to play with? And the way I've kind of figured it out is that for retro systems, I'm probably just going to stick with this guy. Like everything up through Dreamcast and, Nintendo 64, all that is going to be on this device. For everything else, GameCube and PS2, and maybe if I feel like I want to add some heavy-duty shaders, I'll still be busting this one out, but I honestly feel like the majority of my gameplay time is now going to be with the 476H, even though these are both excellent handhelds. So putting it all together, it kind of feels like we're in the same old predicament that we're always in with Anbernic, in that they release a bunch of devices all the time, and they're incrementally better than the previous one. Sometimes they're a little bit worse than the previous one, but generally they get better and better. And it's one of those things where if you've already got one of these handhelds, you've been following them for some time, then it may not be worth that $150 jump to get something like this, even though it is an excellent handheld. So to really help to break this out and who this device is for, we're going to break it down into 3 different personas, which I've done from time to time. This one is called Annie, this one is Billy, and this one is Jean. So let's start with Annie. Annie has never bought a retro handheld, but she loves playing retro systems. The first question I would ask her is, Annie, are you okay? Because why haven't you bought a handheld yet? And if you are going to buy a handheld, I would say that if you're looking for something that's 4:3 aspect ratio and you want to focus on things that are, below the GameCube era, then the 476H is going to be an excellent fit for that price point. There are better handhelds out there if you're willing to pay more money. It really depends on your budget, but at $150 to $175, I think that the RG476H is going to be the best fit for Annie. Now, Billy's a funny guy. He reminds me of my nephew who took the day off today to go and buy a new iPhone, the iPhone 17 or whatever it is, but he's got the iPhone 16. Like, why did he need a new one? And that's because he likes having the shiny new thing. And I can see the same thing happening with a lot of hobbyists where maybe they do have some of the previous handhelds, but they do think this upgrade is worth it and they don't mind buying yet another handheld. Thankfully, these are a lot cheaper than a new iPhone, so it becomes a little bit less painful on the wallet. So Billy's the type of guy who is going to buy the latest and greatest even if he has other handhelds, as long as this latest and greatest one also checks off all of the boxes that he has, and I see that handheld doing that. And then finally we've got Gene, who is the more patient and less impulsive younger brother of Billy. And Gene's been around the block too. He's got a couple handhelds, but they're all kind of showing their age. For example, he's got like the RG476H, which is an excellent little handheld. It can play up to PS1, but it's got a 3.5-inch screen, which makes it nice and pocketable, but also a little bit squinty. And so he's kind of in the mood for an upgrade. And so again, Gene is kind of like the opposite of Billy, where he doesn't buy the latest and greatest like my nephew and his new iPhone. I am not shopping for a new iPhone today. I've got an iPhone 15. I think it's perfectly fine. I'm going to wait until it feels a little bit old and sluggish, and then I'm going to upgrade. And Gene is at that point in his handheld adventure where he feels like it's time for an upgrade. And I think in that case, the RG476H is an excellent upgrade from one of these cheaper handhelds, just because it's going to give you a lot more performance power. You're going to have just a lot of other things you can do within the Android ecosystem, but it still has that familiar comfort and excellent controls that you may be used to with one of these other handheld devices. So I think among these three personas, hopefully you found where you fit among them and whether or not this will be a good fit for you. And I honestly can see all three of these, Annie, Billy, and Gene, either choosing or not choosing this handheld based on their budget and what they're looking for right now. In the end, whether or not I recommend this handheld comes back to you as always. It's going to depend on your budget, what you're looking for, and what you already own. As a first-time buyer, and if this is within your budget, then I think it's an excellent starting spot. If you've already got something very similar, it's probably not worth that upgrade price. For me personally, I can see this becoming my main retro handheld for systems like Super Nintendo because we have that large display, 4.7 inches, 4:3 aspect ratio, that high refresh rate and high resolution. Combine that with the plastic shell and the stacked shoulder buttons, this is an excellent little retro machine. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.